Welcome. I'm Richard Davis. I'm the chair of the United Utah Party, and you're watching Uniting Utah, the podcast of the United Utah Party. And with me today is Jim Bennett, who's our communications director,
Hello.
and Ammon Gruwell, who is a candidate for the United Utah Party in House District 15. So,
Hello.
Ammon, maybe you could tell us where House District 15 is, what area it covers, and a little bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, of course. So District 15 is in Davis County. It spans West Kaysville, Southwest Layton, and Southern Syracuse. So it's all west of the freeway in northern Davis County. So a little bit about myself, my background. So I have a wife, I have 3 sons, and actually a 4th one on the way. It's due in about a month.
Oh, congratulations.
So that feels like a freight train just barreling towards me, but pretty excited for that. So yeah, 4th boy, still no girls in the family.
It just reminds me of Jim Gaffigan when he said, all right, when you have 4 children, it's like, imagine you're drowning and somebody hands you a baby. That's what number 4
That sounds about right.
So
no, but we love our little kids. They make life a lot of fun.
And how old are they?
So I have a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old. So 1.5 to 2 years in between each one of them.
Oh my goodness.
They have lots of energy.
I remember those days. Not too well, though.
Well, I try to black them out. We had twins for our 3rd and 4th, and we just don't remember any of their toddlerhood. It's just, anyway. It's a blur.
I hear they get a lot easier once they're teenagers, right?
They do, actually. People kept saying they wouldn't, but they did. So
maybe you lucked out.
The best age for children is when they're adults.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun when they're adults.
Yeah.
They bring grandkids over, right?
I haven't gotten there yet. Richard has, but I haven't.
Yes, I have. Anyway, tell us more about your background here.
Sure. So I was born in Provo, Utah. I actually lived in Vernal, Utah for most of my childhood. I moved to Texas, to San Antonio for my high school years. Before returning back to Utah, I went to Brigham Young University, did a bachelor's in electrical engineering, and then I went on to get a master's as well in electrical engineering. I graduated in 2017, and I started working for a company called L3 Harris, which is a defense contractor that makes cutting-edge communications technology for the U.S. military and for U.S. allies as well. And so my background is obviously in science, in tech, but I have a passion for history and for politics, and I think that's really what led me to want to run for office, is that passion. I decided fairly early on that I wanted it to be more of a hobby than a day job, and so that's how I ended up in engineering, but I think that's always been my passion.
Well, we can't relate to that interest in politics. That's just not something we can.
Of course not.
In terms of your political background then, have you been involved in party politics? Is there, have you come from another party into the United Utah Party? Or were you always an independent?
It's a great question. So I was raised in a very conservative household. I remember growing up, my mom had Rush Limbaugh playing on the radio, and Glenn Beck on Fox News playing on the TV all the time. And so that was the environment that I grew up in. I found myself, very much agreeing with conservative ideals, and I still agree with many of their ideals to this day. I feel like they have many good arguments, and there's a lot of good evidence for a lot of conservative political ideals. But then in 2016, 2015, 2016, when, like many others in Utah and across the country, I just found myself increasingly alienated from the Republican Party and from Republican politics in general. I just felt like with each passing day, the people that I saw on TV representing what I thought was conservatism were no longer representing my views, and I felt like the Republican Party veered off into the weeds. And so that really brought me to my own political coming of age, I guess you could say. I started thinking about a lot of ideas. I started reading a lot of books and developing my own opinions, my own ideas. And, you know, when at the end of the day, I ended up leaving the Republican Party and becoming a political independent. Some of my views shifted a little bit to the left. Many of them stayed on the right. And just in general, I found myself somewhere in the middle, honestly, in no man's land, with two political parties battling it out over what I felt like was minutia. So here I am. When the United Utah Party came on the scene in 2017, I just felt like it was no brainer to join because it felt like a political home for me. They were non-ideological. They were focused on better government, on evidence-based policy. And I just felt like it was the best of both worlds.
Great. Yeah. And your story is quite familiar for us because we hear it quite a bit from people who are in the party now. So you are running against Brad Wilson, the Speaker of the House. Why do you want to be a legislator and defeat Brad Wilson? What do you bring that you think will be a better representation?
That's a great question. So that question makes me think of a book that many have, I'm sure, read, Stephen R. Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. In there, there's an analogy where he's talking about a team of people making their way through the jungle, cutting a path through this jungle. And, you know, there's a bunch of workers chopping away at vegetation with their machetes. And there's, you know, their managers, their administrators, creating schedules and motivating people to work hard. And then there's the leader who climbs up the tallest tree, looks out over the landscape and says, "This is the wrong jungle." And all he hears from below, from his administrators, are saying, "No, we're making progress. This is great." But I feel like that's the big difference between an administrator and a leader. The leader is the one that can say, "No, we're getting caught up in this minutia. We're veering off track in these very important and essential ways." Coming back to Speaker Brad Wilson, I feel like he's a very effective legislator. Obviously, he wouldn't be in his position if he weren't. And he's obviously well liked in his party, and he's been effective at getting legislation passed. But I feel like many others, being that effective administrator, he's missing the fact that they have gone off track. They've gone off into the weeds. And I feel like, obviously, as a millennial, I don't have decades of experience in politics. But I feel like just over the years of reading political philosophy and history and in volunteering in the trenches in grassroots causes over the last several years, I feel like I have a vision that could take us in the right direction. And so that's why I would like to represent this district.
Well, I'd love to hear you expand a little bit on what that vision is. What would your priorities be if you were to be elected? What are the causes that are near and dear to your heart?
Yeah, great question. I think maybe people have heard this too often, but I feel like it can't be said enough. We have a political system that has systematic flaws. And when you have a system that has such fundamental flaws, you can't fix them by just digging your trenches and fighting the other side even harder. You see these two political parties that are just so entrenched and just lobbing hand grenades at each other and hoping that next election they'll get enough of a wave to be able to hammer through legislation that they want. And I feel like that's missing the whole point of how our government is supposed to work. Our government is supposed to be based on compromise. Our government is supposed to be really led by the people and by the will of the people. Right now, I see politicians being so motivated, incentivized to appeal to big donors and to corporations and special interests, because the enormous amount of money that they get from these entities is the lifeblood of politics in our day. I see this as the definition of corruption. I mean, you don't see athletes paying off referees before the game without, serious repercussions. And yet you have corporations and businesses paying money to the men and women that are regulating their industries. I don't see how that should be legal in our country, if not extremely limited, to the extent where it plays much less of a role. I think one of the biggest systematic reforms we need to make is to bring influence and power back to average voters. For example, Brad Wilson, he has a lot of money in his campaign account right now. He has over $100,000, but 99% of that money is all from national corporations. Last year alone, in 2019, he received one contribution from a constituent. One. I don't feel like that's how our politics should work. And
well, Utah is one of the few states that has absolutely no campaign finance restrictions at all. On a federal level, when I ran for Congress, I couldn't accept corporate donations. And I could only accept $1,500 donations from individuals. And that's not the case in Utah. Utah, anybody can give anybody any amount of money they want.
Anything goes.
Corporations. It's just unreal.
Exactly. So I read a really influential book for my political philosophy. It was called The Dictators Handbook. And obviously that title is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's written by a couple of American political scientists, and they're talking about how dictatorships around the world work, and then they extend those principles to democracies. And the idea is that if a dictator only has to keep 10 people happy to stay in power, he can give those 10 people enormous amounts of money, make them rich, and then he stays in power. If you have to keep 1,000 people happy, you can still divide up state resources and make those 1,000 people pretty happy, right? If you have to keep 50 million people happy, there's no amount of dividing up of state resources that you can really make a huge difference. Yeah, maybe you can give each of those 50 million people a few dollars, but that's not enough to motivate them to vote this way or that way. And so that's why increasing the proportion of people in your district or in your state or in your country that are actually at the table having a say of who's winning elections is enormously important, because the only way to keep 50 million people happy is by good public policy.
That's a great point.
And so when you get people like Brad Wilson, who literally he's not answering to his constituents at all. He's literally answering just to those people that are donating tens of thousands of dollars to him. If he just has to keep those 10 corporations happy, then he will stay in power and stay as the person who's making laws for our state.
A good example of this was, I think it was last year, Energy Solutions had been giving donations to legislators. And I think it was last year that they sort of called in the IOUs and asked for a tax break. And guess what? They got it. They got it particularly from the legislators. And by the way, this is both Republicans and Democrats who had been getting their money over several years. So yeah, that connection is there. It was actually, I think it was Barney Frank, who was a representative from Massachusetts, who said once that my vote cannot be bought, but it can be rented. And he also said, it's so odd in politics that people, strangers will give you money. But of course, they don't give money just, for good government. They give money because they expect something in return. And the legislator needs to give that in return, because what will happen is the next go around, the next election, they'll be defeated if they haven't voted the way that they're supposed to, or at least there'll be an attempt to defeat them. So it's a system that we're working as a Unite Utah Party to try to change, and in a variety of ways. And campaign finance reform is one of those. Term limits would be another way, because if you buy a legislator, they don't stay bought because they're out of office, and you have to start over again. So it makes it harder to buy a legislator, and they're not there for a career. They're there for a set amount of time, and then they leave. So those sorts of things. One of the criticisms that we get, maybe concerns, is that, okay, so you elect some legislators. You're not going to elect a majority. We know that. So what good could they do? They're not going to be in the Republican caucus. They're not going to be in the Democratic caucus. Can they really accomplish anything? What advantage do you think you might have as a United Utah Party legislator?
Yeah, so over the last few years, I've volunteered for several grassroots political causes. For example, I was in a state leadership position in an organization called Stand Up Republic, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that advocates for democratic reforms, advocating for the rule of law and political or freedom of speech and so on. And one thing I found in volunteering for this organization is, as much as we advocated, as much as we put out ads, as much as we, tweeted out our positions, at the end of the day, it was just noise. It was just trying to influence the people who actually had influence. And I believe that having a legislator in the Utah legislature that can actually make votes and can actually build those relationships with other legislators and build those coalitions and propose bills, actually having a person in that position with the backing of the voice of the people, that makes all the difference. And more than anything else, it's getting the party's foot in the door. I think one of the biggest hurdles that we face as a third party is just that most people don't know much about us. And having a legislator in there, being cited by the press, every time they say, okay, this is how many Democrats and how many Republicans voted on this bill, well, they'd have a line in there that says, and this is what the United Utah Party did. And as people see and come to find themselves agreeing with the positions of the United Utah Party, I think that would take our party to the next level and help us make huge strides here in Utah.
Very cool. So tell me what your campaign is like. Do you have a website up? Where can people find you?
Yes, of course. So ammongruwell.com is my website.
Spell your last name, if you would.
Yeah, so first name Ammon, last name Gruwell.
I'll put it up on the screen when we edit this so everybody can see it.
Great.
Good.
And then I have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, also Instagram. We've been posting some YouTube videos as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can follow the campaign. I recently published an article or an op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune as well on ranked choice voting.
I saw that. So I thought it was very, very good. Very thoughtful.
Well, thank you.
Have you gotten some good response from that?
Yeah, I mean, I got a few donations. That's always welcome. Everybody that I've heard from really liked the article, and I felt like it was really well received. It's an issue that I'm very passionate about. Obviously, my whole campaign isn't focused on campaign finance reform, but I love talking about electoral reform and government transparency as well. And ranked choice voting, I think, would go a long way to improving our elections.
Well, we're looking forward to helping you to win and getting the word out about who you are, because I think you'd be a great legislator. So
thank you so much.
Let's get you elected.
All right.
Good plan.
So, You've been watching another episode of Uniting Utah. Thank you very much for doing that, and we'll see you next week.